For today's video, we're going deep into Russia's dark past, specifically the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, to tell a story that will push you to your limits. Back then, 5 prisoners in Russia were promised that they would be released from a prison camp if they took part in an experiment. Their task was simple: to remain awake for 30 days under constant surveillance, isolated from the world in a sealed chamber into which a special gas would be introduced to keep them awake. The chamber in which the experiment would take place was equipped with couches, but there were no mattresses, pillows, or blankets. However, there were books for entertainment, water, a toilet, and enough food supplies for all 5 men for more than a month. The chamber was equipped with thick glass windows through which the scientists could observe them. Microphones were placed to record every sound. The first 5 days passed without any notable incidents. The prisoners behaved normally, although some of them showed the first signs of sleep deprivation, irritability, slight paranoia, and difficulty in holding conversations. But on the night of the 5th day, their mood changed markedly. The men began to behave increasingly paranoid, each suddenly suspecting the others of plotting against them. Through microphones, the scientists could hear the prisoners whistling in secret and distorting their conversations to the point of incomprehensibility. Some of the men began to scribble in their books, while others paced restlessly around. As the 2nd week dawned, however, the prisoners' behavior completely escalated. They shouted and screamed into microphones, tore pages from books, and stuck them to the windows, blocking the view of the investigators. After that, there was only silence, until the 14th day. Finally, the researchers decided to end the experiment and announced over the intercom that they would release the men. Instead of joy, however, only a single quiet phrase came back from the microphones, and that was, "We no longer want to be released." When the investigators opened the chamber anyway, they saw a sight of absolute horror. The prisoners had not touched their food rations since day 5. But that didn't mean they hadn't eaten, just that they hadn't eaten any of the food, so the room smelled and looked like a slaughterhouse. Those of the men who were still alive had been transformed into savage creatures who looked as if they had lost all consciousness of their humanity. As they were taken out of the chamber, they simply whispered frantically over and over again that they wanted to return to the gas-filled room because they wanted to stay awake. The story about the Russian sleep experiment probably made your blood run cold, but you can breathe a sigh of relief. This experiment never actually took place. Instead, more than 10 years ago, a Russian online forum held a contest to invent the creepiest urban myth. Urban myths are modern myths that are spread everywhere as supposedly true stories, and that many people therefore believe to be true. This is what happened with the sleep experiment. The story quickly spread from the forum to the whole internet and caused fear and terror. However, this does not mean that there were no comparable experiments in the 20th century. In fact, in the last 100 years, scientists have carried out some pretty crazy experiments on humans, and some of them are even worse than the fictional Russian sleep experiment. So we'd like to introduce you to 3 of them. You probably all know that the National Socialists conducted horrible and insane experiments on humans during World War II. But the fact that there was also a doctor in Japan during World War II who was just as ruthless as the infamous Dr. Mengele in Germany is a little-known fact. Microbiologist Shiro Ishii did research at the so-called Unit 731, an institution of the Japanese Army. And he did this in the field of epidemic prevention. What sounded reasonable at first was just plain weird. Shiro Ishii was not investigating pathogenic microorganisms under a microscope or trying to help the sick, but was deliberately infecting them with the worst diseases in completely pointless experiments to see what would happen. But the doctor didn't stop there. He tried all sorts of things on innocent prisoners and recorded how long they survived the various procedures. His experiments had names like peeled tree trunk And you can imagine that it wasn't a tree trunk that was peeled. Shiro Ishii also experimented a lot with the effects of extreme cold and high pressure differences. Over the years, many prisoners of war fell victim to the experiments, which Shiro Ishii diligently recorded in writing. What is particularly shocking is that Shiro Ishii was never punished for his unthinkable actions. Because after Japan surrendered in 1945, the doctor traded all his records to the Americans for his freedom. The American government hoped that this move would provide them with valuable scientific knowledge. But that did not happen. Shiro Ishii later died a natural death and was never prosecuted for anything. The US also conducted horrific experiments throughout history. While the inhumane treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay is probably familiar to most, the Americans also conducted a completely inhumane experiment that few people know about. From 1946 to 1948, the US government conducted a syphilis experiment in Guatemala, which only came to light almost 15 years ago thanks to the research of a researcher. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, and normally, research is done by examining and observing sick people and trying to help them. In the Guatemalan syphilis experiment, however, women who were already infected were deliberately persuaded with money to have intimacy with mentally disabled people. Of course, many of them became infected and died as a result. It was not until 2010 that then US President Barack Obama apologized to the victims and their families. Legal proceedings are still ongoing as to whether they will receive compensation. Finally, we now come to a secret US research program from which thousands of people suffered even as late as the 1970s. The CIA, the US intelligence agency, organized mind control experiments under the codename MK Ultra. The aim of the program, which lasted over 20 years, was to develop a genuine truth serum as we know it from the movies. In other words, a substance that would make people incapable of lying when administered. The ultimate goal was to get foreign spies to talk. To make this work, the substance was supposed to destroy existing consciousness in order to implant a new consciousness in the resulting void. The evil thing about the MK Ultra experiment was that the CIA was testing various substances on people who had no idea about them. They were simply administered to civilians undergoing medical treatment or in clinics for completely different reasons. While they thought they were in good hands with the doctors, they were unwitting test subjects of experimental substances and suffered severe physical and mental damage that seemed completely unexplained. Like all the other terrible experiments in this video, the MK Ultra project ultimately led to nothing but great suffering. The CIA destroyed almost all the files on the decades-long secret experiments, and only gradually were the investigative committees able to reconstruct that the research program, with all its terrible consequences, was not a conspiracy theory, but that the secret experiments on unsuspecting civilians had actually taken place. Which of these experiments surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments. Otherwise, leave a like if you found this video interesting and subscribe to Wise Fool. Thanks for watching. See you next time.